The umbrella was too expensive for the hook it was hanging on. That was the first thing Sofia Reyes noticed when she came out of the kitchen at the end of her double shift, untying her apron with fingers that still smelled like dish soap and industrial fryer oil. The hook by the service entrance held the usual wreckage of things people forgot at Carmela's diner: a child's knitted hat, someone's reading glasses in a case held together with a rubber band, a fabric tote bag faded to near colorlessness. But the umbrella hanging there didn't belong in that company. It was black, matte, with a handle carved from something pale and smooth that caught the yellow overhead light in a way that cheap plastic simply couldn't. The fabric of it was heavy, folded into perfect pleats. Even collapsed, and still, it looked like it cost more than Sofia made in a week. She stood there for a moment, coat half on, and looked at it. The diner had cleared out in the last hour. The after-church crowd and the late breakfast regulars were long gone. Only 2 tables had been occupied for the tail end of her shift: a college kid nursing his 3rd refill of black coffee over a textbook, and a man who had sat alone by the window for 40 minutes, drinking his espresso without looking at his phone once. Sofia had noticed him the way she noticed all the solo customers who didn't fidget. Most people, when they sat alone in public, performed aloneness. They scrolled, they checked the time, they rearranged the sugar packets. This man had simply sat. Dark coat, dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples. A face that would have been handsome in a different kind of life, in a life that hadn't honed it down to something this precise. He'd left cash on the table, more than enough. No card, and walked out without waiting for his change. Sofia had pocketed the extra $4 because that was what you did when someone left cash, and she'd cleared the table without thinking much more about him. But now she was thinking about the umbrella. She crossed the service area, coat trailing from one shoulder, and lifted it off the hook. It was heavier than she expected. The handle was cool and smooth bone, maybe, or a very good resin, and carved into a slight curve that fit her palm with suspicious precision, like something made to be held. There was no tag, no identifying mark on the outside. She turned it over, ran her thumb along the edge of the folded fabric, and felt something: a small pocket sewn into the interior of the canopy near the shaft. Inside it, a card. She pulled it out carefully. It was thicker than a normal business card, the kind of thickness that meant it had been ordered from somewhere that charged by weight. The paper was a deep charcoal gray, and the text was printed in silver that caught the light the same way the umbrella handle did: quietly, precisely, without trying. There was no business name.no title. No address, just a name and a phone number. Dante Caruso. If you're already feeling this story, pull at something in you. Hit that like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to me. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to her. Sofia stood in the back corridor of Carmela's diner at 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon, holding a business card that probably shouldn't have been left somewhere like this, and she made the kind of decision that changes a life without announcing itself. She tucked the card into the front pocket of her jeans, hung the umbrella back on the hook, and finished putting her coat on. She was going to call the number. Not because she wanted anything from it. Not because she was naive enough to think returning a lost umbrella would lead somewhere. She was going to call the number because the umbrella was clearly expensive, because whoever owned it had probably already noticed it was missing, and because Sofia Reyes had been raised by a woman who returned things that didn't belong to her. Her mother had drilled it into her from the time Sofia was old enough to understand you don't keep what isn't yours. Not even when you need it. Not even when no one would ever know. Sofia needed money. That was the constant, grinding truth of her life at 27. She needed it the way other people needed air, not as an abstract concern, but as a physical pressure that lived in her chest and woke her up at 2 in the morning. She was 3 weeks behind on rent for the apartment she shared with her brother Marco, who was 23 and brilliant and had cerebral palsy and required the kind of daily support that the state funded partially and inconsistently, and that Sofia made up the difference for with her body, with double shifts and picked up weekends and the occasional catering gig that paid cash under the table. She was not going to keep a stranger's umbrella because she was poor. She wasn't that kind of poor. She took it off the hook and carried it out the front. The neighborhood was a grid of narrow streets in the part of the city that tourists didn't visit and developers hadn't gotten to yet, close enough to the water that the wind off the river had teeth, far enough from anything desirable that the rents were survivable, barely. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with the clouds. going gold and gray in alternating patches, and the street was quiet in the way it only got after the lunch rush, when the sandwich shops had locked their doors and the people who worked in them had gone somewhere invisible to eat their own meals. Sofia walked half a block to her usual spot, a low concrete planter outside the shuttered insurance office on the corner, and sat down. She pulled out the card, turned it over. The back was blank. She pulled out her phone. The battery was at 19%, which was a problem she'd been managing all day because the charging cable in the break room had stopped working and she hadn't had time to deal with it. She told herself she'd make this quick. She dialed. It rang twice. Then a voice answered, and Sofia's first thought was that whoever had recorded this voicemail had a very good microphone, because the quality was unusually clear, and then her second thought arrived half a second later when the voice said simply, "Yes," and she understood with a small jolt that it wasn't a voicemail at all. It was a person. He'd answered on the second ring. "Oh," she said. "Hi. I'm sorry, I was expecting a message." A pause. Brief but total. "Who is this?" "My name is Sofia. Sofia Reyes. I work at Carmela's Diner on Pelham Street. You were in today. I think you left an umbrella. The black one with the handle." Another pause. This one different from the first. The first had been assessment. This one was something else, something she couldn't quite name through a phone line. "You found it?" "Yes. I have it here. I can leave it at the counter if you want to send someone to pick it up, or I can hold it for you until where are you right now?" Sofia blinked. "I'm outside. On the sidewalk. I just finished my shift. Don't move." His voice hadn't changed in temperature or volume, but it had changed in something. Density, maybe. The way a sentence could carry more weight than its words. "I'll come to you. You really don't have to. 15 minutes. The call ended. Sofia looked at her phone for a moment. Then she looked at the umbrella. Then she looked at the street, which was still quiet and gold gray and completely ordinary. She had been expecting to leave a message. She had been expecting to leave the umbrella behind the counter and go home and never think about it again. She had not been expecting to say "don't move" in 15 minutes in a voice that made both of those phrases feel less like requests and more like the natural order of events. She stayed where she was. Not because she'd been told to. She told herself that. She stayed because the sun was still out and it was a public street, and she was tired, and sitting down was simply better than standing up. She stayed because something about the voice made her curious in a way she didn't have a good name for. He was there in 12 minutes. She knew it was him before she consciously recognized him because of the way the air around the street changed when the black car pulled to the curb. It wasn't a flashy car. That was the thing. It wasn't a sports car or a limousine or anything that announced itself. It was large, dark, and moving with the smooth restraint of something that had nothing to prove. The door opened, and the man from the diner stepped out, and he looked exactly as he had 2 hours ago, except that now he was looking at her, and that was a materially different experience. He was taller than she'd clocked from across the dining room. The dark coat fit the way expensive things fit, like it had been made for exactly this body and no other. The silver at his temples caught the afternoon light. His eyes were dark and direct, and did the same thing his voice had done on the phone. They arrived, and then they stayed, without performing the usual social gymnastics of looking away and back. He simply looked at her, and the look said that he had noted everything worth noting and was now deciding what to do with the information. Sofia stood up from the planter because sitting while he stood felt like a position she didn't want to be in. She held out the umbrella. "Dante Caruso," she said. It came out steadier than she expected. "Your card was in the pocket." He took the umbrella from her hand. His fingers were close to hers for a moment, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of the space between them with a specificity that surprised her. He looked at the umbrella briefly, then looked at her. "You could have kept it," he said. "It isn't mine." Something shifted in his expression. So small she almost missed it. "Most people would have." "I'm not most people." The corner of his mouth did something not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "No," he said, after a moment. "I can see that." She should have said something like it was no trouble or have a good day and ended the interaction. She knew that. She could feel the clean exit of it right there, available and sensible and correct. But she was tired and her feet hurt, and 3 weeks of accumulated stress had worn her patience for performing pleasantness down to the wire. "The espresso here is actually good," she said instead. "You should know that. Most people who come in once don't know that because they order the drip coffee, which is fine but not good. But you ordered the espresso, which means either someone told you or you've been here before. He looked at her. I've been here before. I know. I've seen you twice. You always sit at the window. You always come alone. You always pay cash. She didn't know why she'd said all of that. The words were out before she'd decided to say them, which was something that happened to her when she was very tired. The filter between brain and mouth developed gaps. She watched his face for the predictable range of responses. Discomfort, suspicion, the particular irritation of a man unaccustomed to being observed. None of those things happened. He simply looked at her the way he'd looked at her since he stepped out of the car, like he was reading something written in a language he was fluent in. You're very direct, he said. I'm tired. I've been here since 6 this morning. She picked up her bag from the planter. Enjoy the umbrella. Sofia. She stopped. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd said her name the way you say a word in a language you've known a long time, not uncertain, not showing off, just using it because it was the word that belonged there. She turned back. Let me buy you a coffee, he said. For the trouble. It wasn't any trouble. For the honesty, then. She looked at him, this man with the precise coat and the cash payments and the eyes that didn't perform, and she made the same kind of decision she'd made about the phone call. Not the smart decision. Not the safe decision. The one that came from the part of her that had been making herself small and sensible and contained for so long that occasionally a door swung open in her, and she walked through it before she could talk herself back. Okay, she said. 1 cup. They went back into Carmela's. Teresa, who owned the diner and was in the back doing evening prep, looked up when the door chimed and raised her eyebrows when she saw Sofia walk back in with a man she'd never seen before. Sofia gave her a look that conveyed approximately nothing, because she didn't have anything to convey, and they took the window table, his table, she realized, feeling the small, strange symmetry of it, and Sofia sat across from Dante Caruso and tried to remember the last time she'd sat at one of these tables as a customer. She couldn't. She'd been coming to Carmela's for 4 years. She'd never sat on this side of the service. He ordered 2 espressos without looking at the menu, which meant he knew what he wanted and had known before he sat down. And Sofia found herself studying him the way she studied difficult things with the quiet, cataloging attention she usually reserved for the electric bill and the medical supply catalog in Marco's physical therapy schedule, trying to understand what she was dealing with. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she thought, though the precision of his face made it hard to say. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at something, the sun, or decisions, or both. His hands were very still on the table, which was unusual. Most people's hands were always doing something, tapping, fidgeting, turning objects. His were just there, present without being busy, like the rest of him. How long have you worked here? He asked. For years. You like it? She almost said the automatic yes, which was the word that lived at the front of her mouth for questions like that, ready and reflexive. But she'd already decided to be tired today instead of performed, so she said, some days. It's work. It pays. What would you rather be doing? The question landed differently than she expected, because it was genuine. Not small talk dressed up as interest. He was actually asking. She could tell the difference. She'd been taking orders from people her whole life, and she knew the texture of real attention versus its imitation. I was studying accounting, she said. Before I had to stop. I'd go back if I could make it work. What stopped you? My brother needed me. My mother got sick and then she didn't make it. And Marco, my brother, he needs a lot of support. The kind that costs money and time. And I had more time than money, so I traded one for the other. She said it matter-of-factly because that was how it was. Not a tragedy she performed for sympathy. Just the architecture of her life. It was the right call. I'd make it again. Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how is he? Sofia blinked. Marco, you said he needed you. I'm asking how he is. She looked at him. Nobody asked that. Nobody who had just learned that she had a disabled brother asked how he was doing as a follow-up question. They asked how she managed, or they expressed a careful, distancing sympathy, or they changed the subject. They didn't ask about him. He's good, she said, and meant it. He's funny. He reads everything he can get his hands on. He's been teaching himself Spanish through YouTube videos for 6 months, and he's already better at it than I am, which is he's just good. He's good. Something in Dante's face did the thing again. The thing that wasn't a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. The espressos arrived. Teresa set them down with the particular deliberateness of someone who had noted a situation and was choosing not to comment on it. She retreated with the strategic dignity of a woman who would have questions later. Dante picked up his cup. Sofia picked up hers. The espresso was the way she'd described it actually good, and she let herself enjoy it because she had been awake since 5:30 and it had been a very long day, and this was a small, specific pleasure that cost her nothing. "You called," he said. She looked up. When you found the umbrella? Most people don't call. They keep it or they don't think twice about it." He set his cup down. "You called. I told you. It wasn't mine." Most people's version of that is flexible, especially for something worth keeping. Mine isn't. She held his gaze because looking away felt like conceding something. "My mother was very clear about that. You find something, you try to return it. It's not complicated." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. That's the point." He looked at her with that same reading quality that she was starting to understand was simply how he looked at things, thoroughly and without apology. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question, but it had a question's intention. Sofia thought about it honestly. "Should I be? Most people are. You've been coming to this diner alone," she said. "You drink your coffee, and you look out the window, and you leave cash on the table. That's not usually the behavior of someone who wants people to be afraid of them." "The diner," he said slowly, "is the exception." She understood him. She didn't know how she understood him. Exactly, she didn't know anything about this man except his name and his espresso order and the fact that he'd arrived in 12 minutes when she'd expected never to hear from him again. But she understood what he meant, the way you understood certain things not through information but through the quality of how they were said. The diner was where he came to be anonymous, to be nobody, to sit by a window and look at the street and not be whatever he was everywhere else. She thought about what he might be everywhere else. She thought about the card with no title, the cash payments, the car that announced nothing, the way two of the men who'd been standing on the sidewalk when he went inside had positioned themselves where they could see the door. She filed the thought away. "I should go," she said. "I have to get dinner started, and Marco has a call with his occupational therapist at 6. Dante nodded. He didn't argue, didn't ask her to stay. He simply accepted the statement the way he seemed to accept most things as information that now existed in the world, to be noted and processed. She stood. He stood also, which she hadn't expected, that particular old-world courtesy that felt both anachronistic and completely natural coming from him. Sofia. She was starting to understand that he said her name at the beginning of things he meant. "Thank you." It was an umbrella. It was an honest thing done without being asked. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "In my experience, that's rarer than an umbrella." She didn't have an answer for that. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked out of Carmela's diner into the cooling afternoon, where the two men were still standing on the sidewalk and the black car was still at the curb, and she did not look back. But she thought about his eyes the whole walk home. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had 3 things wrong with the elevator for every 1 month that it worked correctly. Sofia climbed the stairs the way she always did, quickly, because the stairwell smelled like something she'd given up trying to identify, and the lights on the second landing had been out for 6 weeks, and she'd filed the complaint and nothing had happened, and she'd accepted that nothing would. This was the architecture of a building managed by someone who knew his tenants couldn't easily leave. That someone was a man named Victor Holt, and Sofia had met him exactly twice, once when she'd signed the lease and once 3 weeks ago when he'd come to the door in person instead of sending the usual text, because the usual text had gone unanswered for reasons Sofia was not proud of. She'd been $200 short on the rent. She'd told him she'd have it by the end of the week. He'd looked at her the way men like him looked at women like her, like he was doing a calculation, and he'd said he could make arrangements if the cash situation didn't improve, and the word arrangements had carried a weight that made Sofia, very quietly, very completely furious in a way she hadn't shown on her face at all, because showing it would have cost her. She was still $240 short. The end of the week was Friday. It was Thursday. She'd figure it out. She always figured it out. That was the defining fact of Sofia Reyes's life. She always figured it out, until someday she wouldn't, but that day had not arrived yet, and she refused to behave as though it had. Marco was at the kitchen table when she came in, laptop open, headphones around his neck, 3 textbooks fanned out in front of him. He was studying for the certification exam he'd been working toward for 8 months: medical billing and coding. Something he could do from home, something that paid actual living wages, something he'd chosen with the kind of specific, practical optimism that made Sofia love him so much it occasionally took her breath away. "Hey," he said, and his smile was the same as their mother's. The same dark eyes, the same particular warmth. "Hey." She dropped her bag by the door and came to kiss the top of his head. "How was your day?" "Good." Finish the chapter on diagnosis coding. It's genuinely interesting if you don't think about the fact that a human being is behind every code. Very philosophical. "I contain multitudes." He nodded at the counter. "I made rice and beans. There's enough." Sofia looked at the pot on the stove, the neat stack of bowls already set out. He'd made dinner because he'd known she'd be exhausted, and he'd made the thing that was both filling and cheap because he always knew what the situation was without her having to say it. That was Marco. She sometimes thought he was the smarter of the two of them, except smarter wasn't quite the word. He was clearer. He saw things without the fog of chronic stress that had settled over Sofia's vision like a permanent weather pattern. She changed out of her uniform and came back to the kitchen, and they ate together at the table the way they always did, with the window open a crack even in the cold because the building's heating ran hot and erratic. And Marco told her about the certification material, and she told him about the day with the usual editing the parts that were funny, the regular customers, the coffee. She didn't tell him about the umbrella or the card or the 12 minutes or the espresso on the wrong side of the counter. She wasn't sure why she didn't. Only that it felt like something she hadn't finished processing yet. Something that needed more time in the part of her mind where things sat before she talked about them. After dinner, Marco had his occupational therapy call, and Sofia washed the dishes by hand. The hot water pressure was good tonight, which she'd learned not to take for granted, and then she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook and did what she did every Thursday, which was the arithmetic of their lives. Rent and utilities and Marco's medications, and the copay for the physical therapy that insurance covered partially and inconsistently, and the cost of the textbooks for his certification course, and the groceries, and the small remaining amount of money that was supposed to cover everything else. The numbers did what they always did. They didn't reach. She was good at math. She'd been good at it since childhood, the kind of good that her teachers had made noises about and her mother had been proud of, the kind of good that had gotten her into the accounting program before life had decided it had other plans for her. She could look at a column of figures and understand it precisely and completely, and that understanding, tonight, told her exactly what she'd known this morning. She was $240 short and Friday was tomorrow, and Victor Holt had used the word arrangements. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She didn't sleep well, which was not unusual. She lay in the dark and listened to Marco's voice through the thin wall, still on his call, still engaged, still the person who decided that being limited in some ways did not mean being limited in all of them. And she thought about the things she thought about at 2 in the morning. The rent, the certification exam fees she'd been putting off, the fryer grease that was starting to bother her lungs in a way she was choosing not to investigate, the particular way her mother had looked in the last months, the way Marco had been 12 years old, and she'd been 16, and there had been no one else. She thought, once, briefly, about a man sitting alone at a window table, drinking espresso, looking at the street like it owed him something. She was out of the apartment by 5:45. The city in the early morning was a different creature from what it became by noon, quieter, colder, more honest about itself. The streets held mostly delivery trucks and solitary walkers, and the occasional cluster of night shift workers making their way home, people with the particular exhaustion of those who lived on reverse time. Sofia moved through it with the efficiency of long practice. She knew the fastest route, the warmest block, the bodega that opened earliest and made coffee that was bad but hot and cost $1. She bought a coffee and drank it on the walk, and she'd almost let herself stop thinking about the umbrella and the number and everything she had no business thinking about when she turned onto Pelham Street and saw the black car parked outside Carmela's. It was not yet 6. The diner didn't open until 6:30. Sofia had a key because she opened 3 days a week, and she was scheduled to open today. The car was just sitting there, engine off. Still, she slowed her walk without meaning to. The car door opened, and Dante Caruso stepped out. He was wearing the same coat, or one exactly like it. He looked exactly as he'd looked yesterday, which was to say composed and precise and completely unaffected by the temperature, which was doing something brutal this morning that the coffee in her hand was barely making a dent in. He waited until she reached him, which she did because there was nowhere else to be going. "You're here early," she said, because it was either that or silence. I need to talk to you. He said it the way he said everything, as a statement of fact, not an opening for negotiation. Not inside. Here. She looked at him. Okay. Last night, I made some inquiries. He met her gaze directly. About the building you live in. Victor Holt. What he's been telling his tenants about payment arrangements. The cold crept in around her collar. She didn't look away. I don't know what you think you. I know what he told you. I know what he implied. Something moved behind his eyes, dark and controlled and pointed, the way water moved under ice. And I know you're 2 weeks from eviction if you can't cover what you owe. 3 weeks, she said automatically. Then she stopped, because she'd confirmed it, which she hadn't meant to do. Dante looked at her. He did not look triumphant at being right. He looked, if anything, like a man making a decision that he'd already made and was now simply announcing. Victor Holt will not be coming to you again, he said. Your rent is current. It will remain current. Sofia stared at him. The coffee was hot in her hand, and the morning was cold, and the street was still mostly empty, and she was trying very hard to process what he had just said, which was the kind of thing people said in movies about other people's lives. Not in languages she was fluent in. No, she said. He looked at her without surprise. He'd expected that. No, she said again, more clearly. That's not. You don't know me. You had one conversation with me, and you've paid my rent. That's not. I don't know what you think that buys you, but nothing. His voice was quiet and absolute. It buys me nothing. I don't want anything from you. Then why? Because Victor Holt had no right to say what he said to you. The sentence came out controlled, but with something in it, a current beneath the surface. And because you returned an umbrella when you didn't have to. And because I've sat in that diner a dozen times, and I've watched you work, and I know what kind of person you are. The kind who carries everything herself because she hasn't been given a reason to believe anyone else will hold any of it. Sofia stood very still. I'm not asking for your gratitude, he said. I'm not asking for anything. But I want you to understand that Holt will not approach you with that kind of proposition again. That situation has been addressed. Addressed. She thought about what that word might mean, coming from this man, in this context, with this particular quality of finality. She thought about the car, the men on the sidewalk, the name with no title. Who are you, she asked. Really asked, the way she hadn't quite asked yesterday. He looked at her for a long moment. Someone who doesn't like to see people like you treated the way you were treated, he said. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. They stood there in the cold morning, 6 feet of sidewalk between them, and Sofia made a third decision of the kind she'd been making since she found the umbrella. The kind that didn't come from logic. The kind that came from the thing in her that had always been very good at reading the difference between danger and safety, even when they arrived wearing each other's clothing. She looked at Dante Caruso and she felt the shape of what he was, the power of him, the deliberate quality of his stillness, the way the morning seemed to organize itself around him rather than disturb him, and she also felt something else. The same thing she'd felt when Marco smiled. The same thing she'd felt when her mother said her name. Recognition. Come inside, she said. I'll make you your espresso. She turned and walked to the diner door and unlocked it without looking back. A moment later, she heard his footsteps behind her. The morning light came through the window in long, thin bars, and Carmela's diner smelled of coffee grounds and the particular warmth of a space that had been closed all night. Sofia moved through it automatically. Lights, prep, the morning routine that lived in her hands while Dante settled at the window table. His table. She made 2 espressos. She carried them over and sat down across from him. The way she had yesterday, and the quality of sitting there was different this morning. Yesterday had been accidental. Today was a choice. Tell me why you really come here, she said, and I'll tell you whether I believe you. He looked at her across the small table, with the morning light making everything look simpler than it was. And he told her. She believed him. She shouldn't have. She knew, somewhere calm and practical in herself, that she shouldn't have. But she did. And that was the moment, not the umbrella, not the phone call, not the rent. That was the moment something shifted in the still center of Dante Caruso's carefully maintained world, and he felt it move. He didn't show it on his face, but he felt it. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, 2 people who had no business sitting across from each other were sitting across from each other, and the coffee was good, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to leave. It was 6 minutes past 6 in the morning, and everything had already started. He told her he ran a business. She waited for the rest of it, and when the rest of it didn't come, she said, "What kind?" And he said, "Several kinds." And she said, "That's not an answer either." And he looked at her with something that was, she was almost certain, appreciation. "Import and distribution," he said finally. "Goods from Europe, primarily. Wine, textiles, specialty goods. And the other things." He was quiet for a moment. "The other things require more trust than one conversation earns." Sofia turned her espresso cup in its saucer. "Fair," she said. "But the men outside. The car. The way you knew about my landlord by this morning." She held his gaze. "That's not wine." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Are people afraid of you?" "Yes." "Should I be?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her yesterday, with that reading quality, that thoroughness. "I told you yesterday that you should probably be." "My answer hasn't changed." "And my answer hasn't changed either." She picked up her cup. "I'm not." The morning light was strengthening through the window. In half an hour Teresa would arrive, and the first breakfast customers would follow, and this particular quality of stillness would dissolve. Sofia was aware of that the way she was aware of most good things, with the specific, slightly melancholy knowledge that it was temporary. "My sister died 8 years ago," Dante said. She hadn't expected that. She set her cup down. "She was 23. There was a situation involving someone who worked for me. A dispute that shouldn't have touched her and did." His voice was even and controlled, but controlled in the way that required effort. The way a river was controlled by a dam, the force behind it was what told you how much was being held. "I wasn't able to prevent it. I've spent 8 years making certain that particular failure doesn't repeat itself." Sofia understood, then, what he was telling her. Not the specifics. Not the geography of his world or the architecture of what he did in it. But the thing underneath all of that. The private law he'd written for himself in the years since a loss had carved it into him. "Is that why you come here?" she said. "To sit alone. Because it's the one place where nothing needs protecting." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes. And now you've ruined it," she said, "by making me a project." Something broke open on his face, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one, the bones of it beneath the control. It was there and gone in 3 seconds, but she'd seen it. "You're not a project," he said. "What am I then?" He looked out the window at the street, which was starting to move now, first deliveries and dog walkers, and the early commuters who looked like they'd never fully accepted morning as a reality they had to participate in. When he looked back at her, his expression had settled into something she hadn't seen on him yet, something quieter than the rest of him. "You're someone who returned what wasn't hers," he said. "In my world, that's extraordinary. I'd like to understand it better." Sofia looked at him across the small table and thought about her mother, who had drilled that particular rule into her with the patient persistence of someone who understood that the way you handled small things was the same way you handled everything. She thought about how she'd never been able to explain it to anyone as more than habit. She thought about how this man had somehow found the word for it, extraordinary, and how hearing it applied to something she'd always thought of as simply basic had landed somewhere in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, you can try to understand it." She stood and began collecting the espresso cups. "Starting tomorrow. Right now I have a diner to open, and you have men waiting outside in the cold." He stood. The courtesy again. "I'll come at 8. The breakfast rush will be over. I'll be here." She carried the cups to the counter and heard the door open and close behind her, and she stood at the sink running hot water and thought about 8 o'clock and the feeling of saying "I'll be here" as if it were an ordinary sentence. It wasn't an ordinary sentence. She knew that. She told herself she'd be careful. She was not entirely sure she'd meant it. The days that followed arranged themselves into something that felt, from the inside, like 2 separate lives running parallel. There was the life Sofia had always lived, the double shifts, the arithmetic of the household, Marco's occupational therapy calls and study sessions, the bodega and the stairwell and the building's unreliable heat. And there was the new thing, the thing that had no name yet, which was Dante Caruso appearing at the diner at 8 in the morning 3 days out of 5 and sitting at the window table and talking to her in the spaces between customers. He never stayed long. He was always somewhere else to be, always moving, always the center of invisible orbits she couldn't fully see. But when he was there, he was completely there, no phone pulled out, no glancing at the door, no performing presence while being elsewhere in his head. Just the window and the espresso and Sofia when she had a minute. He told her things slowly. Not everything. Not the things that would require more trust than they'd built yet, but things. His family had come from Naples 3 generations back, and the import business had been his grandfather's idea, a legitimate operation that his father had complicated and that he'd inherited at 30 with the dual burden of profit and consequence. He had an apartment in the building he owned downtown and a house outside the city that he went to when he needed to think. He had no wife, no children. He had associates and subordinates and a structure of obligation that ran in every direction. But the particular human warmth of a table set for more than one that he'd given up on some years ago. He said that last part very carefully, the way you said things you'd mostly made peace with. Sofia recognized the tone because she used it herself. She used it when people asked about her accounting program, about whether she ever wanted to go back. She said probably not with exactly that quality of careful peace, and it was only half a lie. In exchange, she told him about her mother, about the diagnosis that had arrived when Sofia was 15 and the following 3 years that had reorganized their lives completely around the facts of illness and the cost of managing it. About the morning she'd called in to her first accounting class to go to the hospital instead, and how that had become the pattern, and how the pattern had become the life. She told him about Marco's determination, about the certification exam, and what it would mean, not just the income, but the identity of it, the proof that his mind could take him somewhere even when the rest of him required assistance. He sounds like someone who decided what he was going to be and then became it, Dante said one morning. That's exactly what he is. Like his sister. Sofia started to argue and then didn't, because the argument would have required her to claim she'd chosen this life, and she hadn't chosen it the way you chose a preference. She'd chosen it the way you chose to put your hand on a wall in the dark because it was the only solid thing and you needed to keep moving. He wants to meet you, she said instead. Dante looked at her. I told him about the umbrella, she said. Not everything, but the basic version. He's been asking questions. He's persistent. She looked at her coffee. You don't have to. I just thought I should say it. I'd like that, Dante said. She looked up. Meeting him, he said. I'd like that. She'd expected him to deflect. She didn't know exactly why, except that men in his position deflected when things got personal. She'd understood enough about him now to understand that the personal was where he kept himself contained, locked away, protected by the same force he used for everything else. She'd expected the polite version of no. Instead, he was looking at her with something in his face she was starting to be able to read. The thing he did when he meant what he said and didn't need to add anything to it. Okay, she said. Saturday. Come for dinner. She went back to work with the feeling of someone who had opened a door without being sure what was on the other side, and was finding out it was something they wanted. If you're as deep into this story as I am right now, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. I upload new stories every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Your support is the reason I keep going. Now, back to them. The Saturday dinner was Marco's idea of a performance, which meant he'd spent Friday evening reorganizing the kitchen and had strong opinions about what they were cooking, which turned out to be the lamb stew their mother had made for important occasions, a recipe that lived in a notebook covered in her handwriting that they kept in the drawer beneath the silverware like a document of state. Sofia stood at the stove stirring and watching Marco set the table with the particular focused attention he brought to things he cared about. Both places aligned, water glasses filled, the one set of cloth napkins they owned instead of the paper ones they used every other day of the year, and she felt the specific tenderness of watching someone be entirely themselves. Dante arrived at 6:30. He knocked rather than ringing the buzzer, which meant he'd been let into the building by one of his men, a fact Sofia had made peace with in the same way she was making peace with several facts about his life steadily, one at a time, without requiring them to be simple. He was wearing a dark sweater instead of the coat, which made him look different, less like the man she'd first seen at the window table, and more like a man who had a Saturday, which she wasn't sure she'd believed in before tonight. He'd brought wine and something in a paper bakery bag, and he handed both to Sofia at the door, and then he looked across the room at Marco. Marco looked back. They held that look for a moment with the mutual assessment of two people who had both already formed opinions and were now measuring reality against them. You're the one who found the umbrella, Marco said. She is, Dante said. And you're the one teaching himself Spanish from YouTube. Marco blinked, looked at Sofia. She raised her hands. She'd mentioned it. In passing, she'd mentioned it. He turned back to Dante with an expression that had moved from assessment to something closer to interest. I'm at a B2 level, Marco said, which is not fluent, but it's functional. I can read a newspaper. My grandmother spoke 4 languages, Dante said. She said the second one teaches you things about the first one that you can only learn from the outside. Marco's face did the thing it did when an idea arrived that he wanted to examine immediately. Sit down, he said, gesturing at the table with the particular authority of someone who had decided a conversation was worth having. The stew needs another 20 minutes anyway. Dante sat. Sofia stood at the stove and stirred and listened to them talk, and she didn't speak for a long time because the sound of it was something she wanted to let settle the way certain sounds settle the way rain does, or music playing from somewhere else in a building, filling a space you hadn't known was empty. Marco asked the right questions. He always asked the right questions. He had the gift of genuine curiosity, the kind that made people feel like the most interesting thing in the room. He asked Dante about the import business with a directness that stopped just short of personal, and Dante answered with the same careful calibration he used with Sofia, enough to be real, enough to acknowledge the shape of things without drawing their edges in full. Marco nodded like a man cross-referencing against a file he'd already opened. The wine is from Sicily, Marco said, holding up the bottle Dante had brought. From a family I've worked with for 20 years. They have about 4 acres, and they do everything by hand. You won't find it in a restaurant. Is it good? Open it and find out. Marco opened it. It was very good. Sofia had it with the stew and let herself be, for one evening, in a version of her life that felt like the one she'd been moving toward without knowing it. The table felt right. The food tasted the way it only tasted when it was the right occasion. Dante asked Marco about the certification exam, and Marco explained the field with the animation of someone who had discovered that a particular kind of knowledge suited him exactly. And Dante listened with that complete attention he gave to things, asking questions that showed he'd actually tracked what Marco had said 2 sentences ago. After dinner, after Marco had disappeared diplomatically to his room with the stated intention of studying and the actual intention of giving them the apartment, Sofia and Dante sat at the table with the last of the wine and the quiet. Your brother, Dante said, is one of the most interesting people I've met in a long time. I know, Sofia said. I've been trying to get more people to notice that for about 20 years. The world doesn't look for people like him. It waits for them to perform in ways it recognizes. He turned his glass slowly on the table. He deserves better opportunities than the world has offered. He's making his own. He shouldn't have to work that hard for what other people get easily. It was said quietly and without anger, but with the same quality she'd heard when he talked about Victor Holt. A particular kind of cold displeasure that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. His exam fees. What does he need? Sofia went very still. Dante, tell me. No. She set down her glass. That's not what this is. That's not why I invited you to dinner. I know it isn't. He looked at her steadily. Which is exactly why I'm asking. You didn't do it for anything. You did it because you wanted me to meet him and because your mother's recipe needed a proper occasion. He held her gaze. The exam fees. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother's notebook in the drawer. She thought about Marco setting the table with the cloth napkins. She thought about what it would mean for Marco to pass that exam. Not just the money but the identity of it, the proof. And she thought about the $380 that stood between him and the registration deadline next month. $380, she said. It came out quiet. Not defeated. Just true. Dante nodded. I'll pay you back, she said immediately. You'll do no such thing. Dante Sofia. He said her name the way he always did, with that particular weight. Let me do this. Not because it makes me feel powerful. Not because I think you can't. Because you've been carrying everything on your own for 10 years. And there are some things that don't have to be that way anymore. She looked at the table, at her mother's serving dish, still in the center of it, at the wine Dante had brought from people he'd known for 20 years who did everything by hand. Why does it feel harder to accept help than to refuse it? She said. Not to him exactly, more to the room. Because you were taught that needing anything was the same as failing, he said. And you were wrong, but you were taught it so early that it became the way you measured yourself. She looked up at him. I don't think that about you, he said. I want to be clear. I think accepting help is one of the bravest things a person can do when they've spent their whole life being the one other people lean on. He reached across the table, and put his hand over hers. Not squeezing, not pressing. Just there. Warm and certain and solid. Let me help. She turned her hand over under his and felt his fingers close around it, and she said, very quietly, okay. They stayed that way for a moment that was longer than politeness required and shorter than she wanted. Then Dante's phone buzzed, and she felt him register at a small tension in his hand, a shift in his attention that was involuntary and controlled in the same breath, the physical signature of a man whose life called to him constantly. Go, she said. He looked at her. I don't want to. I know. She pulled her hand back gently. Go anyway. Whatever it is, it's been waiting since before you came over here. He stood, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he turned and looked at her across the apartment, at the table still scattered with dishes, at the kitchen light, at her standing in the middle of it all, and he said, Thank you for tonight, Sofia. For the meal. For your brother. Thank you for the wine and the bakery bag, she said. Which we haven't opened yet. Open it tomorrow, he said. It's from a woman on Carmine Street, who bakes them at 4 a.m. You'll taste the reason. He left. Sofia locked the door and stood with her back against it and listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway. And then she went to the kitchen and put her mother's serving dish to soak, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, the specific, terrifying feeling of someone who had begun to want something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. The trouble with trouble was that it rarely announced itself. It was the following Tuesday, a double shift day, and Sofia was refilling the coffee station at the end of the lunch service when she heard the bell above the door and felt, before she turned around, the particular quality of the air in the room change. Not the temperature. Something else. Something that happened when a presence arrived that took up more space than its body warranted. She turned around. Daniel Cruz was standing at the hostess stand. He was handsome in the way certain men were handsome, constructed for an impression, all surface. He'd cut his hair since the last time she'd seen him, which was 6 months ago, and he was wearing a jacket she recognized as new because he always bought new things when he was feeling precarious, when he needed the armor of acquisition. He was scanning the room the way he scanned rooms proprietarily, like he was establishing his right to be there before anyone could question it. He found her. He smiled. Sofia kept her face still. She had learned to do this, to hold her expression neutral and quiet the way you held a surface still on water, because any reaction was information, and Daniel Cruz had always been very skilled at using information. She walked to the hostess stand. What do you want, Daniel? I was in the neighborhood. He said it with the particular ease of someone who had rehearsed ease. Thought I'd see how you were doing. It's been a while. 6 months. Has it? He looked at her the way he always had, like he was calculating the distance between where she was and where he could move her to. You look tired. I'm working. I can see that. He glanced around the diner with the expression she'd always hated, the tolerant pity of someone assessing a circumstance he considered beneath him. Still here. Still here. She kept her voice level. If you're not ordering, I have work to do. Sofia. His voice dropped, which was the first move. The drop was always the first move. It sounded intimate, and it was meant to intimacy as leverage, warmth as a door he could push open. I'm not here to fight. I just want to talk. We don't have anything to talk about. I think we do. He leaned slightly toward her, and she held her ground, because moving back would be movement, and movement was concession. I heard some things. About you. About changes. She went very still inside, while keeping everything outside exactly where it was. I don't know what you heard, she said. But whatever it was, it has nothing to do with you. We were together for 3 years, Sofia. We were, she agreed. And then we weren't. And it's been 6 months. And now you're having coffee with Dante Caruso. He said the name without inflection, which was worse than if he'd said it with anger. Anger she could work with. The absence of it meant he'd already decided something. I'm not the only one who noticed. The coldness that moved through her was not fear, exactly. It was something older than fear, the animal assessment of a person who has learned to read the difference between a threat that was still deciding and a threat that had decided. Daniel was in between right now, she thought. He'd come to take her temperature, to see if she would break formation. She didn't. I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish, she said. But I have 4 tables to reset before the dinner rush. You should go. He looked at her for a long moment. The smile he gave her didn't reach anything behind it. Take care of yourself, he said. I'll be around. He left. Sofia stood at the hostess stand and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, until her hands stopped wanting to shake. Then she went to reset the tables. She didn't call Dante. She told herself it was because it was nothing. Daniel showing up was not new. Daniel making implications was not new. He'd been doing versions of this since she'd ended things, the drive-bys, the text that stopped just short of threatening, the presence in her periphery that was designed to remind her of his existence, to keep her off balance, to suggest that she was never entirely free of him. She knew the pattern. She'd lived inside it. She told herself she didn't call because she handled her own things. She was right about that. And she was also lying to herself about why, because the real reason was something more complicated, the same reason she'd argued about the rent and the exam fees and every other gesture Dante had made. She was afraid that needing him in one context would mean needing him in all of them, and needing someone in all of them was the closest thing to vulnerability she knew. And vulnerability, in her experience, was the thing people had always used. She didn't call. But Dante found out anyway, because of course he did, because this was his city and this was how his world worked, with information moving through it like current through wire, silent and invisible and constant. He called her at 9 that night. "Tell me about Daniel Cruz," he said, without preamble. Sofia sat on the edge of her bed. "How do you?" "He was at the diner today. My people let me know." "Your people?" She absorbed that. The surveillance, she'd been peripherally aware of the men she'd started to recognize, the cars that appeared and disappeared. She'd understood in the abstract that it was there, had chosen not to examine it too closely. Now it was concrete. Dante Caruso knew when Daniel Cruz walked into her workplace before she'd said a word. "He's my ex," she said. "We were together for 3 years. I ended it a year ago, and he's been present since then. It's not a crisis." "What kind of present?" She was quiet for a moment. "The kind that reminds you he exists without doing anything you can point at specifically. The menacing kind." His voice had gone to that flat, precise register. "He hasn't done anything, Sofia." The word landed the way it always did. "Tell me about him." "All of it." So she told him. She told him about Daniel's particular methodology, the warmth that he used as a tool and the anger that he never quite let arrive, because arriving meant he could be held accountable, and he was too careful for that. She told him about the way the relationship had felt from the inside, like standing in a room where the walls were very slowly moving inward, not fast enough to be a catastrophe, just fast enough that you kept adjusting until you couldn't remember where you'd started. She told him about the year of extraction, the careful walking backward out of the pattern, the 6 months of being present in her periphery. She told him about tonight, what Daniel had said about Dante. There was a silence. "He knows who I am," Dante said, "or he's heard enough to know what I represent. Which means he's not just coming to see you. He's coming to assess how close you are to me and whether that changes the calculation." The edge in his voice was cold and specific. "He thinks proximity to me is leverage against you, that you'll want to protect me from complications." Sofia thought about that, about the exact angle of Daniel's approach, about the way he'd said the name Dante Caruso without emphasis. "He's wrong," she said. "I know he is, but he doesn't know that yet." Another pause. "I'm going to speak with him. Dante, not violently, not in a way that will cause you any kind of consequence. But I'm going to make the landscape of his choices very clear to him." His voice was calm in the way tectonic plates were calm, the appearance of stillness over enormous force. "He will not come to your workplace again. He will not position himself in your life as a reminder of his existence. He will redirect his attention entirely. You don't have to do that. I know. I've been managing him on my own." "You have," he said, "and you've done it with the kind of quiet competence you do everything with. But you've also been doing it while carrying everything else, and he's counting on the fact that you're tired, that at some point the management of it will cost you more than the alternative." The weight in his voice was not anger. It was something more considered than anger. "He's wrong about that too, because the alternative, for him, is me." Sofia closed her eyes. She was tired. She was genuinely, bone-deeply tired in the way she got when she'd been containing something for too long. And the specific relief of hearing someone say, "Let me carry this," the specific shame-adjacent feeling of that relief, moved through her simultaneously. "I'm going to say something," she said, "and I need you to just hear it and not argue." "All right. I have spent my entire adult life being the person who handles things, who manages, who stays calm and figures it out, and doesn't let the walls close in completely because someone has to keep them back." She opened her eyes. The ceiling of her apartment was its usual water-stained, indifferent self. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks I've started to let you in on some of that. The rent. The exam fees. Tonight. She exhaled slowly. And every single time I do it, there's a part of me that waits for the cost. The thing that comes after, the way the scale tips. Sofia, I'm not finished. She said it quietly, not sharply. I need to say this. Every person who has ever helped me has eventually told me what they needed in return. Daniel did it. My father did it. People I've trusted at jobs. There's always a cost, and I've always paid it because that's how it works. She sat up. So, I need you to tell me what you want. Not in the polite way. Really. The silence on the other end was long enough that she heard his breath. You, he said finally. In the same way you meant when you said I'll be here on Thursday morning. Not as a transaction. Not as a debt I'm collecting. His voice had dropped below its usual register, to something she'd only heard from him in the apartment over her mother's stew and the wine from Sicily. I want to have a reason to come back to your table. I want to sit across from your brother and talk about languages. I want to find out all the things about you that you've been protecting behind competence and practicality for 10 years because no one made you feel like it was safe to put them down. A pause. That's what I want. Sofia sat with that. That's a lot, she said. Yes. It terrifies me. I know. His voice was steady. I'm asking you to be terrified and stay anyway. She looked at her hands in her lap. Thought about the umbrella on the hook. Thought about the decision she'd made in that corridor, which had looked like a small decision. To call, to return something that wasn't hers and had turned out to be a door. Handle Daniel, she said. But don't tell me the details. Understood. And Dante. She stood, moved to the window. The street below was quiet, the city going amber in the early evening dark. Come to the diner tomorrow. 8 o'clock. I'll be there. She ended the call and stood at the window a moment longer, watching the street she'd lived above for 4 years, which looked different now, not safer. Exactly. Not simpler. But different. Like a map she was reading with new information. Dante Caruso was in her life. She had not planned it, and she could not quite imagine reversing it, which told her something she was still working out the full meaning of. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. She didn't see what happened with Daniel Cruz. She'd asked not to, and Dante had understood the distinction that she wasn't asking him not to act, only asking to be kept separate from the mechanics of it. It was, she suspected, a distinction that most people in his life didn't make, and that he was therefore somewhat surprised she could. She found out that it had been handled on Wednesday evening when her phone showed a text from a number she didn't recognize that said simply, I won't be in contact again, and she understood from the phrasing that this was not a voluntary decision. She deleted the text. On Thursday at 8, Dante was at the window table. She made 2 espressos and sat across from him, and they talked. And this time he asked her about accounting, about what she'd studied, what she'd liked about it, the specific texture of the work that had made her good at it before she'd had to leave. The logic of it, she said, thinking about how to explain it. The way it's a language for describing what's actually happening in a business versus what the business says is happening. The two are almost never the same. She traced a line on the table's surface with her thumbnail, thinking, I was good at finding the gap, the place where the numbers told a different story than the narrative. He looked at her across the cups. That skill is exceptionally rare. It's just math. It's judgment, he corrected. The math is the tool. The thing you're describing is judgment, knowing which story the numbers are actually telling. Most accountants find what they're looking for. You find what's there. She looked at him. I have a specific need, he said, with the particular care of someone choosing words for precision rather than impact. On the legitimate side of my operations. My current financial oversight is adequate, but it's not perceptive. It manages, it doesn't see. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking whether, when your brother passes his exam and you have more time for the things you've had to set aside, you might consider it. When, she said. Not if. When, he confirmed. He's going to pass. I've met him. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about what it would mean working for Dante Caruso's legitimate operations, using the skills she'd put down and covered with years of survival work, finding the gap, seeing what was there. She thought about how it felt to hear him say when your brother passes his exam as if it were a settled fact, which felt presumptuous and also, somehow, exactly right. I'd want to be properly paid, she said. Obviously. And I want to see the financials before I agreed to anything. The real ones. I wouldn't have it any other way. And if I find something I don't like in them, you tell me. His voice was simple and absolute. That's exactly why I need someone like you. Someone who tells me what's actually there. She looked at her coffee. At the window. At this man who had walked into her diner and left his umbrella and been called back to it and had arrived 12 minutes later and had not, since then, stopped arriving. Ask me again in 6 weeks, she said. He nodded. 6 weeks. She got up to handle a new customer, and Dante watched her go with the particular quality of a man who had found something he'd given up believing existed and was carefully, precisely learning not to close his hand too hard around it. He left at 9:15. He came back the next day, and the day after. The pattern was establishing itself the way patterns did, not through decision, but through repetition, through the accumulation of mornings and espressos and the particular rhythm of conversation between two people who were both more careful than most and had both decided, against the evidence of their separate experiences, to be less careful with each other. Marco passed his certification exam on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks later, in a testing center downtown. Sofia took the morning off work and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours and 40 minutes, reading the same page of her novel 6 times. And when Marco came out of the testing room, his face told her everything before he said a word. She called Dante from the sidewalk outside. He answered on the first ring. He passed, she said. There was a pause on the other end that held more in it than pauses usually held. Of course he did, Dante said. Sofia laughed, a real one. Full, the kind that came out before you decided to let it, and she heard something on his end that might have been the same. Come to dinner Saturday, she said. Marco wants to make the celebration meal. What's the celebration meal? Apparently, it involves 3 courses and a level of ambition I'm a little worried about given our kitchen's limitations. She watched Marco navigate toward her across the crowded sidewalk with the particular focused grace he'd developed through years of adapting his body to the city's indifference. He's been planning it since Monday. He had a lot of faith in himself. Justified, Dante said. Saturday. What time? 7. I'll bring the wine. From Sicily? A pause. And then the thing she'd been collecting, the almost smile, the shape of warmth under the control. From Sicily. She hung up and Marco reached her and she hugged him. There on the downtown sidewalk, surrounded by strangers and the noise of the city going about its ordinary, indifferent business. You did it, she said into his shoulder. I did it, he agreed. And then, muffled against her jacket. I need to call my occupational therapist. She's been more nervous than I have. Sofia laughed again. Held him a moment longer. Down the block, she was almost certain she saw a dark car at the curb. She didn't look directly. She didn't need to. She already knew it was there. That night, for the first time and longer than she could accurately calculate, Sofia sat at her kitchen table with the notebook she used for the household arithmetic, and she looked at the columns. The rent that was current. The utilities that were paid. The medication costs that hadn't changed. And on the other side, Marco's new potential income. Her potential new role with Dante's company, which she was going to say yes to and already knew it. The actual, concrete possibility of finishing her degree online in the time that would free up. The numbers still didn't reach, not entirely. There was still more month than money in a way that had become so familiar she'd stopped noticing it as a fact and started treating it as weather. But they were closer than they'd been in years. She closed the notebook. She sat in the quiet of the apartment. Marco was asleep, earlier than usual, the crash after adrenaline. Outside the window the city hummed its usual songs, sirens and traffic, and the particular urban music of a place that never fully went quiet. She thought about Dante. She thought about what he'd said on the phone that night about wanting to find the things she'd been keeping behind competence and practicality, about terrified and staying anyway. She thought about the weight of his hand over hers on the dinner table, about the way he'd said when, not if. She thought about the fact that she had told him things she hadn't told anyone since her mother. Hadn't performed them, hadn't managed them, had just said them the way they were and watched him receive them without using them. She thought about what her mother would have made of him, would have said, probably, that the most important question wasn't what someone did or didn't do in the world. It was whether they were honest with you about it, whether they gave you enough truth to make a real choice. Dante had given her truth. Carefully, incrementally, but real. She was making a real choice. She went to bed. She dreamed about her mother's kitchen, which smelled like the lamb stew. And when she woke up in the morning, the apartment was cold because the building's heat had gone out again, and she lay in the dark for a moment, registering the physical fact of it, the chill, the familiar inadequacy of the building, the ordinary difficulty. And then she got up and put on her coat over her pajamas and went to make coffee. And she didn't feel the weight of it the way she had 6 weeks ago. She felt the same facts. She had just stopped carrying them exactly alone. The trouble, when it arrived on a Saturday. Not Daniel. Dante had been right, that Daniel had understood his choices completely and had redirected himself with a thoroughness that Sofia had noted and chosen not to examine too closely. The trouble was something older than Daniel, something structural, something that had been building in the background of Dante's world in the months since they'd been circling each other. And it arrived on a Saturday afternoon when Sofia was at the diner and Dante's number lit up her phone screen with the particular urgency of a call that wasn't made unless something had changed. She stepped out the back. "I need to tell you something," he said, and the quality of his voice told her this was not a diner conversation, not an 8 o'clock window table conversation. This was the other register, the one that came from the other part of his life. "Tell me," she said. "There's a man, a rival. He's been making moves against my operations for the past 3 months, and we've managed it, but he's escalated." A pause. "He's found out about you. He knows I come to the diner. He knows where you live." The cold that moved through her was different from the one that had come with Daniel. Sharper, more consequential. "What does he want?" she said. "To unsettle me. To make me make decisions from fear instead of strategy." Dante's voice was controlled, but it held that undercurrent. She knew now the thing beneath the dam. "He's not going to touch you. I need you to hear that as a fact, not as reassurance. He is not going to touch you. But he knows where I am. For now, that changes tonight." She understood before he said it. "I want you and Marco to move," he said. "Somewhere I know is secure. One of my buildings on the other side of the city. Better neighborhood, better security, everything you need." His voice was careful, deliberate. "This isn't me managing you. This isn't me using a situation to pull you closer than you want to be. If you say no, I'll put security on your current building and we'll handle it another way." "But you'd rather," she said. "I'd rather know the place you sleep is one I can guarantee," he said simply. Sofia stood in the alley behind Carmela's diner, where she'd been standing since she was 23 years old, taking her breaks between shifts, and she looked at the back wall of the building across from her, which was covered in the kind of faded municipal paint that said this part of the city had been meant for something and had become something else entirely. She thought about Marco's table set with cloth napkins. She thought about the certification exam and the 6 weeks and the way Dante had said when. She thought about what her mother had taught her about returning what wasn't hers. This was different. This was not returning something. This was receiving something. This was the hardest version of the lesson, not the giving back, but the allowing in. "Okay," she said. Yes. We'll move." She leaned against the wall. "But I want to see the apartment first." "Of course. And I want Marco to approve it. If he doesn't like it, we find something else." "Agreed. And Dante," she paused, finding the words. "I need you to tell me about this man. The rival. Not the version you'd tell an employee. The version you'd tell someone who has decided to be in this with you." The silence on his end was long enough that she heard the city sounds behind it, distant, steady, the world going about its business. "His name is Carmine Sessa," Dante said finally. "He's been trying to take my operations in the northern part of the city for a year. He's methodical, patient, and he has no personal code beyond acquisition." His voice dropped. "He looked at what I care about as a way in. He looked at you." "Then he doesn't understand you," Sofia said. "No, because anyone who thought threatening me would make you easier to manage doesn't understand what you actually are." She pushed off the wall. "That's his mistake." Another pause. And then, "Sofia, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is that it's too much. Okay, are you afraid? Not of Daniel, not of moving. Are you afraid of what you've walked into? With me?" She considered the question the way she considered things she cared about, not quickly, not performing an answer, but actually sitting with it. "Yes," she said. "I'm afraid of what it would feel like to lose it. That's a different thing from being afraid of you." She picked up her apron from where she'd draped it on the railing. "I'm going back inside. My tables need resetting. I'll call you tonight about the apartment. I know you will." She was almost smiling. 8 o'clock, or I'll think something's wrong. She went back inside. Teresa was at the counter, wiping it down with the expression of a woman who had been running a diner long enough to know every variety of important phone call by its aftermath. "Everything okay, honey?" she said. Sofia tied her apron. "Getting there," she said. And she meant it. The new apartment was on the 8th floor of a building that Dante owned and did not advertise that he owned, in a part of the city where the streets were wider and the trees had been there long enough to have opinions about the architecture around them. The doorman knew their names before they arrived. The elevator worked. The heat ran at a consistent, governable temperature that didn't require Sofia to wear her coat over her pajamas in the mornings. Marco walked through it room by room on the Saturday they came to see it, touching walls, opening windows, standing at the kitchen counter, and looking out at the view with the particular focused quality of someone conducting a genuine assessment rather than performing one. Sofia watched him from the doorway. Dante stood slightly behind her, not pressing, giving the space its due. "The light," Marco said finally, from across the room. "What about it?" Sofia said. "It's good. It comes in from the east in the morning and the west in the evening." He turned around. "I've always wanted a kitchen with good light. You can't cook well in bad light. I don't care what anyone says." Sofia looked at him. "Yes," he said, the way he said things when he'd made up his mind and was done making it up. "This one. That was it." They moved the following Friday, which was not a lot of time, and also exactly enough, because Sofia had lived in apartments her whole life that she'd been prepared to leave, and she had the packing efficient and unsentimental. What mattered fit in a reasonable number of boxes. The rest was just the sediment of years spent in a place, and she was ready to leave the sediment behind. The building Dante had taken them from was not improved by their absence. Victor Holt continued to own it. The lights in the second landing stairwell continued not to work. But that building was, for the first time in 4 years, no longer Sofia's problem, and she drove away from it in the passenger seat of one of Dante's cars without looking back. He had arranged everything. The movers, the timing, the logistics of Marco's equipment, the quiet repositioning of security that meant the new building was covered in ways Sofia understood existed without needing to know the specifics. It was the version of care that Dante delivered, consistently comprehensive, invisible, executed before she thought to ask for it. She had stopped arguing about this, which had taken the better part of 6 weeks in a series of conversations that had ended, each time, with her understanding that accepting thoroughness from someone who meant it was not the same as becoming dependent on it. The distinction mattered to her. She held on to it. She still opened the diner 3 mornings a week. She still took the double shifts when the schedule needed covering. She was still Sofia Reyes, who handled things. She was also, increasingly, something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was taking up real space in her life. The way good things did not by announcement, but by presence, by the gradual replacement of empty with inhabited. Dante came to the new apartment the weekend after they moved. He stood at the kitchen counter where Marco had said the light was good and looked out at the view, and then turned and looked at what Sofia had done with the space, the photograph of their mother on the shelf, the notebook of recipes propped open to a dog-eared page, the particular way she'd arranged things that said this is a home and not just a place we are staying, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had moved him and he was deciding how much of that to show. "Good," he said. It was one word. But Sofia had learned the weight of his words by now, how much they carried when he used them simply. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." They sat in the good morning light and drank the coffee, and Marco joined them with a textbook and his headphones around his neck, and for a little while all 3 of them were in the same room, doing different things, and it was ordinary, and it was the most extraordinary version of ordinary Sofia had experienced in years. Carmine Sessa did not know that this was happening. He knew the surface facts that Sofia and her brother had moved, that Dante had placed them somewhere secure, but he did not know the texture of it, the coffee and the good light and the notebook of recipes. He knew only his version of the situation, which was the version organized around leverage and threat and the assumption that a man like Dante Caruso would respond to pressure the way all men did by protecting what he loved at the cost of everything else. He was wrong about that, not in the way he thought he might be wrong. He was wrong in the way that only became clear when it was already too late. Sessa made his move on a Wednesday. Sofia was at the diner, mid-morning, the breakfast rush 2 hours gone and the lunch hour still approaching. The diner had the quiet it only had in this particular gap, Teresa restocking in the back, 2 tables occupied by people who had nowhere particular to be, the radio doing something low and indeterminate. Sofia was filling the sugar caddies at the counter when her phone rang with a number she recognized as belonging to Dante's head of security, a man named Paolo who had the bearing of a retired general and communicated exclusively in sentences under 10 words. "Miss Reyes," he said, "don't go outside. Stay in the diner." Sofia set down the sugar. "What's happening?" "Cessa sent someone to the block. We have eyes on him. Mr. Caruso is handling it. You stay inside." "Is Marco?" "2 of ours are at the building. Your brother is fine. He doesn't know anything is happening." A pause that was, for Paolo, almost verbose. "You stay inside until I call again." He hung up. Sofia put the phone in her apron pocket, went back to the sugar caddies. Her hands were steady, and she took a specific, private note of that the steadiness, the absence of the old panic spiral. She'd felt that spiral her whole life, the one that started when things went wrong and picked up speed until it consumed all available thought. It wasn't there now. In its place was something colder and more functional. Assessment. She was in a public place in the middle of the morning with people around her. Dante knew. Paolo knew. She was to stay inside. She stayed inside. She made herself a coffee, and she sat at the counter, and she waited with the quality of waiting she'd learned from years of hospital waiting rooms, not passive, not resigned, just present, not burning fuel on the things she couldn't affect. Teresa came out of the back at some point and took one look at her and poured herself a coffee too and sat down 2 stools over and didn't ask any questions, because Teresa had been running this diner for 22 years and she knew the difference between a woman resting and a woman holding. They sat there together. 45 minutes later, Dante called. "It's done," he said. Sofia exhaled. "What happened?" Cessa's man was turned back before he reached the block. "Cessa himself is currently in a conversation with several of my people that I expect will last the rest of the day and result in a comprehensive understanding of why this approach was inadvisable." His voice was controlled, deliberate, the business register. But underneath it, she could hear something else now that she'd had weeks to learn his frequencies. She could hear the thing that had been coiled in him all morning releasing. "It's over, Sofia. The immediate piece of it. And the longer piece. Being handled. He's losing ground on every front he tried to gain it on. By the end of the week, there won't be anything left for him to press with." A pause. "He made the mistake of thinking you were a weakness. I let him think that long enough for him to commit to it." She understood what that meant. That Dante had seen Cessa coming and had let him arrive at a conclusion and had built the response around that conclusion. That the past 3 weeks, the new apartment, the security, the careful positioning had been both protection and preparation. Both things at once, as everything with Dante seemed to be. "You used it," she said. "I used the fact that he saw you as a vulnerability to position him where I could remove him completely." His voice was even. "I want you to know that. I want to be honest about it." She thought about it. About what it meant that he'd let a threat get close enough to think it had leverage. About the calculation of that. About whether she should be disturbed by it. She found she wasn't. She found that what she felt was something closer to understanding the recognition that this man moved through a world where every resource was a tool and every threat an opportunity if you were skilled enough to let it arrive on your terms. He was skilled enough. He'd always been skilled enough. The thing she was learning was that he used that skill, now, with her in it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You asked for the real version." "I did." A pause. In the background of his call, she heard something she couldn't identify, and then it was gone. "I'm coming to the diner. 20 minutes. "Dante, you don't have to, I know." His voice had changed now, below the business register, and the frequency she'd come to understand was the one that had no performance in it. 20 minutes. He arrived in 18. He came through the front door, and Sofia was at the counter, and he crossed the diner without stopping and put his hands on her face the way he had at his window when she'd told him about the rent. Except this time, it wasn't gentle in the way that was careful, it was gentle in the way that was grateful, the way that was something else, the way that said here is where the control stops. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said, which was not a word she'd heard from him often and which, in his mouth, right now, said more than most people managed in paragraphs. He kissed her forehead, then her temple, Then he pulled her in and held her against him in the middle of Carmela's diner at 10:53 on a Wednesday morning. And Sofia put her hands against his back and felt the full structure of the tension, leaving him not just the morning, not just Sessa, but something older than that. The 8 years. The sister. The decade of holding everything alone because alone was the only way he'd known how to do it without the cost becoming unbearable. She held him back. Teresa, from behind the counter, made absolutely no comment. She simply topped up the coffee carafe and found something to occupy herself with in the other direction, which was the most generous thing she'd done in 22 years of running the diner, and that was saying something. They sat at the window table, not because it was his table, because it was theirs now, and had been for a while, and they both knew it. "Tell me something," Sofia said. "What?" "Something you've never told anyone. Not the architecture of it, not the shape of it. Something specific." She watched him across the cups. A small thing. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding, could see the familiar calculation of how much, how far, how real, and then she saw the moment it resolved, which looked like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. "My sister's name was Elena," he said. "She was 5 years younger than me, and she thought I was funnier than I am. She used to, when we were children, she used to laugh at things I said that weren't meant to be funny, and it made me try harder to be worth the laugh." He looked at the table. "For a long time after she died, I stopped trying to be funny. I didn't realize it until recently." Sofia thought about the almost smile. The shape of it, but not quite, that she'd been collecting since the beginning, filing away, returning to. "You've been trying again," she said. "I've noticed." He looked up. "It's still not very good," she said, "but it's getting better." His face did the thing. The full thing. This time the actual smile, arriving completely, softening the precise angles of him into something that looked like what he must have looked like before the world had made him careful. It lasted longer than 3 seconds. She counted. "I'll work on it," he said. "See that you do." They sat there for a while longer, talking about nothing urgent. Marco's plans to take a second certification course, the bakery on Carmine Street where the woman baked at 4 in the morning, whether the espresso at the diner would ever be as good as the espresso in Naples, which Dante said it wouldn't, and Sofia said she'd take his word for it since she'd never been. And Dante said something, quietly and almost incidentally, about how that could change. She heard it. She let it sit between them without picking it up yet, because some things needed time before you knew what to do with them. But she heard it. That afternoon, after Dante left, Sofia sat in the break room of the diner with her notebook, not the household arithmetic notebook, but the other one, the one she used for thinking, and she wrote down the shape of the last 7 weeks. Not the facts of it. The texture. The quality of being seen without being managed. The specific difference between someone who helped you because it made them feel powerful and someone who helped you and then worked very carefully to ensure you knew you had the option to walk away. Dante had always given her the option to walk away. She had always not taken it. That was a choice. She'd been making it, quietly and consistently, for 7 weeks, and it was time to stop pretending it was still pending. She closed the notebook. She called him. He answered on the second ring, which was how he always answered. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that you keep saying 'in my world,' as though there's still a clean line between your world and mine." She leaned back in the break room chair, which was the same chair it had been since before she started working here, built for function and not for comfort. "There isn't. There hasn't been for a while." Silence. "I'm saying I know that," she continued. "And I'm saying I'm not pretending otherwise anymore. I'm in this. The whole of it, the way you asked me to be, the way I've actually been for weeks without naming it." She looked at the wall. "I thought you should know." His voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Sofia, I know it's complicated. I know what his world means, what the dangers are, what I'm choosing. I'm choosing it anyway." She paused. "You told me to be terrified and stay. I'm still here." The silence on his end was the particular kind that came before something true. "I need to see you tonight," he said. "Then come." He came at 7. Marco answered the door because Marco had developed the habit of doing this when Dante visited, with the particular energy of someone who had decided that the man in his sister's life was worth his attention and had therefore made it his business to provide it. He opened the door and assessed Dante with the directness he brought to everything, and then stepped back and let him in. Sofia was in the kitchen. The good evening light was doing what Marco had said it would, coming in from the west at an angle that made everything look like it was worth something. which everything was, just not always in the ways that were easy to see. Dante came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, and Sofia looked at him, and he looked at her, and Marco looked at both of them and then said, with the devastating clarity of a man who had been watching this for 7 weeks, "I'm going to my room." "You don't have to," Sofia started. "I know," Marco said, over his shoulder, already halfway down the hall. "I want to. Call me when dinner's ready." A pause. "The lamb's in the fridge. I started the marinade this morning. Don't mess it up." His door closed. Sofia and Dante stood in the kitchen in the good evening light with the silence Marco had left behind, which was the warm kind. Dante crossed the kitchen. He took her hands first, the way he had at the table, both of hers and both of his, looking at them for a moment as if he was establishing a fact he wanted to be sure of. Then he looked up at her. "My life is not simple," he said. "I know. There will be more moments like today. Not Sessa specifically, but versions of it. The world I operate in generates conflict. I can minimize it. I can keep most of it away from you. But I cannot guarantee Dante." She said his name the way he said hers, with the weight of meaning it. "I didn't ask for a guarantee. I asked for honesty." She turned her hands over in his, holding rather than being held. "You've given me that. From the beginning. From the beginning, I let you find an umbrella," he said. "That wasn't honesty. That was circumstance." "It was both," she said. "The honesty came after. You could have let me call and then sent someone to collect it. You could have managed the whole thing from a distance. You came yourself." She watched his face. "You've always come yourself. I think that's the thing you should understand about yourself." He was quiet. "You say you're not a good man," she said. "You've said it more than once. And I think what you mean is that you've done things that don't fit inside the boundary of what the world calls good." She stepped closer to him. "But every person I've ever known who was genuinely dangerous didn't warn me. They didn't give me options. They didn't sit across from my brother and ask him about language because they were actually interested." She held his gaze. "You warn people. You give options. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole thing." Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then he kissed her. Not the forehead. Not the temple. Her. The way that meant everything he'd been careful about for 7 weeks. All of it, arriving at once. She kissed him back with the same completeness, with the full version of herself she'd been managing and rationing and protecting behind practicality for a decade. And it was the most honest thing she'd done in as long as she could remember. When they broke apart, he kept his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I want that to be clear before anything else." She closed her eyes for a moment, felt the words land in the specific place that had been empty for a long time. "I love you too," she said. "That's also clear." He exhaled. It was such a human sound, so unlike the controlled register of everything else, that she almost laughed. She pressed her face against his shoulder instead, feeling his arms come around her. "Marco made a marinade this morning," she said, into his coat. "I heard. We should probably make the lamb." Probably. Neither of them moved for another minute. Carmine Sessa was removed from the equation by the end of that week, as Dante had promised. Not violently or not in ways that reached the surface of things, not in ways that would arrive in a newspaper or a police report. His operations were dismantled with a precision that left him with nothing to rebuild from and no allies willing to absorb the consequence of association. He understood, by Friday, that he had made an error of a kind that could not be recovered from, and he relocated his interests to a different city with the kind of quiet urgency that said he had understood the communication perfectly. Dante did not describe this to Sofia in detail. She did not ask for detail. She asked, once, whether anyone who hadn't chosen to be involved in Sessa's choices had been hurt. He said no. She believed him and moved on. That was the agreement they'd reached, not the terms of her ignorance, but the terms of her knowing enough to make real choices and not more than serve that purpose. She was not a participant in the parts of his world that required violence or coercion. She was not shielded from the knowledge that those parts existed. The line between those two things was the one she'd drawn, and he had respected it completely. She started working for Merino Imports 3 weeks later. The legitimate side, as he'd said, in exactly the capacity he'd described finding the gap, seeing what was actually there versus what the narrative said was there. Her first week, she identified 3 inconsistencies in a supplier contract that had been generating a small, steady loss for 2 years that nobody had caught because everybody had been looking at the numbers the contract said to look at. She told Dante on Friday afternoon, in his office, with the documents spread across the desk between them, and he looked at her analysis with the focused attention he gave to things he cared about, and then looked up at her. "How long did it take you?" he said. 3 days. But I was learning the filing system for the first 2. 3 days, he said, with a quality in his voice she recognized as the same quality he'd had in the diner when he said your value is immeasurable, as if he were noting something the world had been miscategorizing. She took the job officially the following Monday. She kept 2 shifts a week at the diner, because Teresa needed the coverage and because Sofia had not yet decided who she was without the apron as one of the layers, and she suspected the decision didn't need to be rushed. Marco started his 2nd certification course in the spring and had his first client by June, a small medical practice 2 neighborhoods over that needed exactly the kind of careful, intelligent billing management he was perfectly suited to provide. He worked from the kitchen table in the good morning light, and he was, Sofia observed, the specific kind of happy that came from being exactly where your abilities were needed. She had wanted this for him for so long that seeing it arrive felt like something she needed to sit down for. She sat down for it. She let herself feel it completely. Dante had done this. Not alone Marco had done it with the determination he brought to everything, and Sofia had done it with the decade of holding that had kept them both alive, but Dante's resources had removed the barriers that had made the possible feel impossible. The exam fees. The apartment with the good light. The time Marco now had because Sofia was not working herself into the ground to cover what the world had failed to provide. She told Dante this one evening, plainly and without ceremony, sitting at the kitchen table after Marco had gone to bed. She told him what it meant, what she'd seen in Marco's face that day, what it had cost her not to be able to give that to him earlier. Dante listened. He did not offer the things people sometimes offered in these moments, the reassurances, the reframings, the well-meaning diminishment of the difficulty. He just listened. And when she was done, he said, "You gave him everything that mattered. The rest was just resources." "Resources matter," she said. "They do. And you'll always have them now." He said it simply, the way he said things he was certain of. Whatever else changes. Whatever comes. That part doesn't. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the evening light this time, the west-facing kind that Marco had approved. "You're planning ahead," she said. "I'm always planning ahead. For us." He met her eyes. Yes. She let that sit between them in the warm, settled way of something that didn't need to be argued with. The future was there, implied and real, not a question mark, but a fact in development. She wasn't afraid of it. That was the thing she'd noticed. In the past weeks, the specific absence of the old dread, the waiting for the cost feeling. It wasn't there. She'd checked for it. Regularly. The way you checked a healing thing to see if the tenderness was still present. It wasn't. What was present instead was something she didn't have a word for. Something that was partly safety and partly recognition and partly the very specific feeling of being in motion towards something instead of braced against it. She was in motion. She was choosing to be. Summer arrived, and with it the particular quality of the city in the heat, the fire escapes, and the sound of music from windows and the ice cream carts, and the way the light went golden by 6 and stayed that way for hours. They walked in it sometimes, the 3 of them, which had not been something that happened in Sofia's old neighborhood with the same ease. Marco knew the names of 3 bodega owners on the new block. He'd started doing the crossword at the coffee shop on the corner every morning, and the woman who ran it had started saving the paper for him before he arrived. Sofia watched this and felt the particular gravity of what had changed. Not just the apartment, not just the money, the lightness, the way Marco moved through the world when the world was not arranged against him. She told Dante, one night, "I used to be afraid of what wanting things would cost, of reaching and finding out the reach itself was the mistake." He was quiet, listening. "I don't feel that anymore," she said. "I don't know when it stopped, exactly. But it's gone." He was lying beside her in the dark, and she felt him turn his head toward her. "It stopped," he said, "around the time you told a man you'd just met that his espresso habit was something you'd cataloged." His voice had the warmth in it, the frequency she'd come to know as home. "You weren't afraid then either. You were tired, and tired got you past it." She thought about that, about the corridor and the hook and the decision to call, about how many things had started in that single ordinary moment of returning what wasn't hers. "I want to go to Naples," she said, into the dark. "Eventually." I want to see where the espresso is actually good." He was quiet for a moment. "I know a place," he said. "My grandmother's neighborhood. There's a bar on a corner, not a bar, a coffee bar that opens at 5 in the morning, and the same family has run it since 1938. Tell me about it." So he did. He told her about narrow streets and salt air and the particular brightness of southern Italian mornings, about his grandmother's kitchen and the language she'd spoken that was somewhere between Italian and dialect and entirely itself. He told her about Elena, who had loved the city and had wanted to go back every summer. He talked about her more easily now than he had in the beginning, not without weight. The weight was still there, but carried differently, in the way that grief settled when it had been witnessed by someone who knew you well enough to hold it carefully. Sofia listened until his voice slowed and stilled, the way it did when he was moving towards sleep, and she lay in the good dark of the apartment that had the right light and thought about umbrellas and business cards and the things that changed a life by arriving in the wrong place at the right moment. She had returned something that wasn't hers. She had gotten back something she hadn't known she was missing. In the morning there would be work, the contracts, the numbers, the gap between what was said and what was true, which she was getting better at finding every day. In the morning Marco would be at his kitchen table in the good light, working, thriving, building the version of his life he'd decided to build, and that no longer had to be built around scarcity. In the morning, probably, Dante's phone would ring before he was ready for it, because his world called to him constantly and always had, and he would handle it the way he handled everything, with the control that was not coldness but precision, with the code that had no public name but that she understood completely. In the morning they would be themselves, fully and without apology, in the complicated real life they were making together. But tonight the city was quiet. The light through the curtains was the soft amber of late evening, and Dante was asleep beside her, with his breathing even and the careful architecture of his face finally, entirely at rest. Sofia watched him for a moment. Then she closed her eyes. There is a kind of story that doesn't announce its own importance. It doesn't start with a grand gesture or an impossible coincidence. It starts with something small: an umbrella on a hook, a business card in a pocket, a phone call that 100 other people would never have made because the umbrella was expensive and no one was watching, and keeping it would have been so easy. Sofia Reyes made the call because her mother had taught her that you return what isn't yours. That honesty is not a strategy, not a performance, not something you practice when it's convenient. It's just the way you move through the world, even when it costs you, even when it would be so much easier to walk out the door and forget you'd ever seen the hook. She made the call, and Dante Caruso answered, and the rest of it: the rent, the exam fees, the new apartment with the good light, Marco's clients, the lamb stew and the wine from Sicily, and the 4 in the morning bakery, and the word eventually said about Naples. All of it was downstream from that single ordinary decision. This is what the stories never quite say clearly enough. The life-changing moments almost never feel like life-changing moments when you're in them. They feel like being tired at the end of a double shift. They feel like standing in a corridor looking at something that isn't yours and deciding, for no complicated reason, to do the simple thing. Sofia did the simple thing. And Dante Caruso, who had built an empire on the knowledge that most people didn't, who had spent years inside a world where honesty was a vulnerability and trust was a transaction and warmth was the thing you kept hidden because hidden things couldn't be used against you. Dante Caruso answered the phone and came in 12 minutes and sat across from her at the window table and kept coming back. He keeps coming back. That is the part of this story that matters most, and the part that is hardest to explain, and the part that Sofia herself doesn't have a clean sentence for when Marco asks, which he does, occasionally, with the directness he brings to everything. She says, he's honest about what he is, and I'm honest about what I need, and we meet somewhere in between. Marco says, that's not very romantic. She says, no, it's better than romantic. It's real. She is right about that. They are right for each other in the way that isn't simple and was never meant to be, in the way that involves the full truth of two people who have both been carrying too much for too long and have finally, stubbornly, decided to set some of it down. Not all of it. You don't put down everything you've been shaped by, and you don't ask someone else to put down theirs. You just stop pretending the weight isn't there, and you stand close enough that the carrying is shared. That's what they did. That's what they're doing. On the windowsill of the apartment with the good light, There is a black umbrella with a pale handle carved into a slight curve. Marco asked once why she kept it. She said because it was the beginning. He said the beginning of what? She said, everything. Thank you so much for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, the videos on your screen right now were made for you. I think you'll love them. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.